Welcome back, class. We are starting our second section for World History 1, and we are going to be jumping into the exciting world of ancient Egypt. As you can see behind me, we are in Egypt with the Great Pyramids. Now, one of the things I've been trying to do is get the green screen background and myself to coordinate so I don't pop up on the video, but so far I just cannot get it to work. So you'll just have to bear with me, and I'll pop up and begin the videos. But we are looking at Egypt, ancient Egypt, and we are going to be spending a good number of videos, maybe four or five videos in ancient Egypt, and we're going to be looking at an overview of many years. There are many dynasties in Egypt, and Old Kingdom, New Kingdom, and the different things that the rulers did and pharaohs did, and just the different things that were going on in ancient Egypt. Many people, think of Egypt, they think of the Great Pyramids. That's the long-lasting, enduring symbol of Egypt, which is it's actually a burial tomb for the pharaohs. And so we'll be looking at different things in Egypt, such as the pharaohs and their agriculture and their ruling, how they ruled, the gods that they worshipped. Mummification, which is pretty interesting because many of the things that we know about Egypt, especially the rulers of Egypt, are from the tombs, from the pyramids, and mummified bodies of the people that were buried. So we'll be looking at some different aspects in ancient Egypt. It's a pretty interesting time period to look at. We'll be looking at hieroglyphs. We'll be looking at different aspects of their religious system. So it's just an interesting thing to study and to look at. So hang on, and we're going to move now into our first PowerPoint on Egypt. Okay, class, we are going to be looking at ancient Egypt. You can see on the screen there the Sphinx, the pyramids, camels, the desert. You think of these things when you think of Egypt. Maybe images of Pharaoh or King Tut's sarcophagus, or a tall obelisk, or hieroglyphics. You think of these different things when you think of ancient Egypt. Maybe someone has been fortunate enough to go visit Egypt and see these great sites from ancient Egypt. But we are going to begin today with our lecture with the beginning of Egypt. When did it begin? Now, there's discrepancy when it began. Some say as far back as 3000 BC, which, if you are a young Earth creationist, that would be maybe just before the Tower of Babel. So we have to be careful in regards to the dating of ancient Egypt. The safe thing to say is that ancient Egypt was established, the civilization there, around the same time as Sumeria. The reason that there's such discrepancy is because of the archaeologists' dating of the finds that they discover. And so when you look at the different time periods that are overlapping from different archaeologists, they all don't agree on the dating of certain sites. So there's discrepancy on the actual founding of ancient Egypt. But it is safe to say that probably around the same time as Sumeria, because of the people that were born after Noah and his family, and people migrating and going around to different areas and establishing their civilizations all the way until the Tower of Babel, where God scattered many people all around the world there. So it's safe to say that around the same time as Sumeria. Now, it was definitely one of the most prominent of early African societies. It was an agricultural society in northern Africa because of the deposits along the Nile River and the fertile river basin that they were able to grow their agriculture. So when we look at ancient Egypt, one of the first geographical features that you think of is the Nile River. The Nile River was of so much importance, to the ancient Egypt, because basically it was their lifeblood for Egypt. So we see here, just for the sake of giving a date, we'll say around 3000 BC, roughly that time. And life was dependent on the Nile River, Nahal, the Nile River. It's the world's longest river. Okay, the world's longest river. It's 4,160 miles long from its source at Lake Victoria to its outlet in the Mediterranean Sea. During the spring, the rain and melting snow would swell the river, and it would go north, surge north through modern-day Sudan, going north into Egypt, continuing north all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. And in 1968, a dam was built, and the Nile flooded many plains to produce very rich layers of fertile soil, so they could even have more agricultural in the modern times. The Nile River, the gift of the Nile River, historians called Egypt that. They called it the gift of the Nile River, because if there was no Nile, there would basically be no Egypt, because this is where they lived. This is where they were able to farm and produce food. There in the floodplains that produce fertile soil for agriculture. Very important to understand that it is the lifeblood of Egypt. Along the Nile, there are cataracts. Cataracts are steep cliffs, kind of like waterfalls within the Nile, and then these waters would then calm, and there would be a navigable area of the Nile, and then more cataracts would step down, and then more navigable water, and then more cataracts, and then more all navigable water, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. So it's basically divided by these cataracts. And once it gets towards the Mediterranean Sea, it branches off into many different little rivers, which would basically make up the Nile Delta, the fertile delta, right before it dumps into the Mediterranean Sea. Agriculture was a key role. There on the screen, you see the Nile Delta there. Notice its Upper Egypt is in the south and Lower Egypt is in the north, and that is because of the step down. Lower Egypt is elevation, so it would step down to Lower Egypt in the north. And you see there the Nile Delta, and this imagery from a satellite shows the green fertile area for agriculture next to the stark desert. But agriculture was key to ancient Egypt. They produced the different crops, and in such quantity that it led to population increase. And as we looked before, population increase means more of a complex society, because there's more people and more people to rule over. So society began to be established, a complex society. They produced wheat and barley, and that was introduced from Mesopotamia. And this high level of agriculture caused the population to increase, which led to a need for organization and a need for government. They had to deal with public affairs. They had to deal with the people. And foreign enemies were not too much of a concern for Egypt, because right to the north was the water of the Mediterranean Sea. To the west was the large arid desert, so not too many enemies would be coming that direction. Basically, the enemy would be coming from the northeast, which would be coming from along the east side of the Mediterranean Sea, down what would be through modern-day Israel, into Sinai, into Egypt. So that would be where their threat was, because even the Red Sea to their east protected them. So really they had to... they didn't focus too much on enemies. They did have enemies, and they fought wars, but they basically needed organization and government to handle the population increase of ancient Egypt. So they became united, and this united Egypt, it was originally two kingdoms, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north, like we saw on the map just a second ago. And they were united by Menes. Sometimes he's called, this ruler, this king, he's called Narmer, Menes. And after he united the kingdoms, they had peace for about 1,000 years. And this is what we would call the Old Kingdom of Egypt. And the Old Kingdom. Let's go back here briefly, talk about Menes. He's sometimes identified as the earliest Egyptian ruler that we know. Ambitious. He was an ambitious minor official from southern Egypt. This information is from your textbook. One interesting note for us here at Mid-America, because we are right near the city of Memphis in Tennessee, the same name city was Menes's capital. Memphis, Egypt was Menes's capital, and it became a political and cultural center for ancient Egypt. He was the first ancient Egyptian to leave a written record. And he built a centralized state that was ruled by a king, or which would be known as a pharaoh. A historian named Manetho reported that Menes ruled for 62 years, and then he was killed by a hippopotamus in the river Nile. Now, this is debated because the historian Manetho lived 2,000 years after Menes. So not sure where he got his source or his information, but that is what is said. Now, when we start looking at the old kingdom of what Menes ruled over, there was the old kingdom dates of around 2600 BC to 2100 BC, and the Old Kingdom, there's a very important symbol of that kingdom, which was the pyramids. All right, so pyramids were built all throughout the area for entombing people. The three on the screen are the Great Pyramids, but they had some other pyramids which were not so large. Most of these were constructed between 2600 and 2500 BC. And the Egyptians deny that the Hebrews had any part in building the pyramids. Sometimes we think of maybe from a movie or a cartoon, the Israelites being slaves to being the ones that built the pyramids. The Egyptians actually deny that, say it wasn't the Hebrews that built the pyramids. But Menes was an ambitious minor official from southern Egypt, and he rose to power, conquering Lower Egypt and united the kingdom to create a new crown. And he basically created the first dynasty of Egypt. A dynasty was a line of rulers from the same family. One of the things that the Egyptians believed in ancient Egypt was that the pharaoh was an absolute ruler, and that he was divine, that he was God living on earth, and that the pharaoh would be worshipped. So we see here at the start of this lecture the beginning of ancient Egypt and the first kingdom, the Old Kingdom, that Menes was the first dynasty began the first dynasty in Egypt. There's other periods that we're going to get more into the periods next lecture, but there was the Old Kingdom, which we're looking at here. There was the Middle Kingdom, and then there was the New Kingdom. We'll look at those in the next lecture. But just to give you an idea, in all, from the beginning of ancient Egypt to 332 BC, so for well over 2,500 years, there were 32 dynasties that ruled in Egypt. They worshipped Pharaoh. We'll go back to that slide. They worshipped Pharaoh because he believed he was a god living on earth. The word Pharaoh comes from the word meaning great house. So he would be the leader of the dynasty. He would be leader of the great house. And they were the absolute rulers of the land. And the people would worship Pharaoh. They believed in many, many gods, but they would worship Pharaoh. And it wasn't until later in ancient Egyptian history that they were actually called pharaohs. We use the word pharaoh because it's what we're so familiar with. But early Egyptian history, the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom, etc., they would be known just as kings, but we call them pharaohs because we're so used to calling the ruler of Egypt a pharaoh. Early pharaohs were connected to Horus, the sky god. I think I have a slide. There we go. Horus, the sky god, or he was a falcon god of the sky, and you see there a picture of him leading a lady, and you see his falcon head, so that would be Horus. Later rulers viewed him, Horus, as an offspring of Amon, which was a sun god, Amon, and Pharaoh was basically looked at as the son of the sun god, son, S-O-N, of the sun god, S-U-N. And we see that most pictures or representations of Pharaoh were large, towering figures that towered over the human subjects because of their belief that they were divine. This next picture here is Ra, or Re, which is also a sun god. Now, he was different because he was looked at as the god who created everything, and you may have heard of him because he's probably one of the most popular that you would think of, the god of Ra, and he would be like the powerful deity. He was definitely the central god of the Egyptian pantheon of gods, and he represented sunlight. He represented warmth and growth. He was worshipped more than any other god, and the pharaohs always tried to connect themselves to Ra, wanting to show basically that they were the earthly manifestation of Ra, even though they were connected through Horus, the falcon god. He had a falcon head, as you can see there in the representation, with a crown of a sun, which was a disc, a large disc on his head, and this sun disc was encircled by a cobra. And you can see the head of the cobra sticking out of the sun disk. And the cobra's name was Uraeus. Uraeus was the cobra's name. So it got very intricate. Ra had a sun disk crown with a cobra around it named Uraeus. And you can see there some sort of a Egyptian, I don't know if that's a woman or a priest, doing something. It looks like smoking something towards Ra in that representation. All right, the next false god we're going to check out here is Osiris. Osiris is the god of the dead. Now, Osiris is unique because the living pharaoh, when they died, the belief was that they became Osiris at the time of their death. And Osiris was known to have a black-green skin, which symbolized the rebirth and resurrection from the dead into the afterlife as Osiris. Now, Osiris was the father of the god Horus, which was the sky god, as we see up there on the top of the screen, the falcon god of the sky. Well, Osiris was his father. So the Egyptians believed that Pharaoh would turn into Osiris, the father of Horus. Egyptians believed that Osiris was the one that gave Egypt the crop of barley. This was very important because barley was the most important crop, or one of the most important crops of ancient Egypt. And our last god that we're going to check out here is Anubis. Anubis, the god of mummification, or also the god of embalming. This is one of the most iconic gods of ancient Egypt. He was the guardian of the dead. The priests in Egypt would wear Anubis mask during mummification. So when they were preparing the body to mummify them, they would put a mask on that represented Anubis. They believed that death was not the end, but the beginning of a new existence. And they went to great length to prepare the bodies for the afterlife. They believed deeply in immortality, that even though they died on earth, that they were immortal and they would continue on in another life as some other, in this case, some other god for the pharaohs. Old Egypt believed that ruling elites were the ones that survived the grave. So only the pharaohs and the pharaoh's family and other nobility, they were the ones that would be embalmed for the afterlife. And in the New Kingdom, which was later on, eternal life was available to normal Egyptians and other classes and other levels of the ruling class. They were able to be embalmed. Anubis was also known as the guardian of the scales, which means he watched over the entire process and made sure that the heart was weighed correctly. And this would determine if the person was, the deceased person was able to move into the afterlife and have a good standing or a good position into the afterlife. The mummification process, which we're going to get into later on in another lecture, use sweet-smelling herbs and plants so that Anubis would only smell the fragrant scents, and they would not smell the scent of death, because they believe that only the pure could move into the afterlife on a good standing, into, let's say, paradise, if you want to look at it that way. Only those of good standing would be able to move into that. So Anubis would smell the fragrant scent and believe that this person that is deceased could move into the afterlife on a good standing. As I've said numerous times so far today, there was such a focus of the Egyptian life, and that was death. Everything was focused towards the afterlife. And there was this ancient Egyptian funeral text called the Book of the Dead. And this Book of the Dead had a collection of spells which would enable the soul of the deceased to navigate through the afterlife. So one of these, spell 125, is the best known of the texts in the Book of the Dead. And spell 125 describes the judgment of the heart of the deceased by the god Osiris in the Hall of Truth. And this is one of the best known images from ancient Egypt, even though the god with his scales is never actually described in the text. This spell talks about Osiris, that false god, and the judgment of the heart. As you see there on the screen, you see this term river Styx. River Styx was a river that the dead soul would have to cross to reach the underworld. The only way for this deceased soul to cross the river Styx was on a ferry boat rowed by a terrible boatman named Charon. Charon would demand payment for his service of rowing the deceased soul across the river Styx. The name Styx is derived from the Greek word stux, meaning hate or to detest or detestation. So this was their belief on how one crossed over to the afterlife. They had to pay this ferry boat, rowboat man, to take them across. So how is it that we know so much about ancient Egypt? This is very important. You probably have heard of this because it's a software that you can use to translate foreign language or learn a different language that you don't know. But the Rosetta Stone, this is how we know so much about ancient Egypt. We'll come back to that guy in a second. The Rosetta Stone was a stone with writing on it in two languages. It was written in Egyptian and in Greek. And it used three different scripts. So you have two languages in three different scripts. You had hieroglyphic script. You had demotic, not demonic. It's called demotic, D-E-M-O-T-I-C, demotic script, and the Greek script. It was a decree issued at Memphis, Egypt, in 196 BC during the Ptolemaic dynasty on behalf of King Ptolemy V. So we have three scripts, and we might say, well, why is there three scripts? Well, the Rosetta Stone is written in three scripts because when it was written, there were three scripts being used in ancient Egypt. The first one was the hieroglyphic script, which you probably imagine the little pictures. And this is the script that was used for religious documents. And so they would use hieroglyphs for the religious writing. Second was the demotic script, which was basically the common script that the Egyptians used in their day-to-day life. And the third was Greek, because Greek was the language used by the rulers of Egypt during the time that the Rosetta Stone was written. And it was written in these three scripts so that priests, government officials, and rulers could all read it. So as I said, the Rosetta Stone was carved in 196 BC, and it wasn't found until 1799 AD. So about 2,000 years or so later, the Rosetta Stone was found. It was found by French soldiers who were rebuilding a fort in Egypt. And the Rosetta Stone was found in a small village in the Delta called Rashid or Rosetta. It was also called Rosetta, so that's where it gets its name. The Rosetta Stone is a text written by a group of priests in Egypt to honor the Egyptian pharaoh. It lists all the things that the pharaoh has done, that are good for the priests and for the people of Egypt to know. So they find this. Well, it wasn't deciphered for several decades. Found in 1799, these hieroglyphs were not even deciphered until 1822. It was very difficult for them to structure this. Even though it was 3 different scripts, it was 2 languages, and it was translated by this guy with his hand in his coat, Jean-Francois Champollion. I think I said that right. Champollion. I'm not French and I don't speak French, so I'll do the best I can. Champollion. He was the man who deciphered the hieroglyphs in 1822, so early 19th century. Okay, so how is it that he deciphered the hieroglyphs? Well, he could read Greek and he could read Coptic. And he was able to figure out 7 demotic signs that were also related to Coptic. And by looking at these signs in Coptic, he was able to work out what the demotic sign, what that meant. And then he was able to trace this into the hieroglyphic sign. And by working with some hieroglyphs that were understood, he was able to make very accurate, educated guesses for what other hieroglyphs stood for. And what came out of it was an understanding of hieroglyphics. There we go. So we see some pictures there of hieroglyphics. These are sacred writings. The ancient Egyptians believed that it was important to record and communicate information on religion and on government. So they invented this written script in the picture form, the hieroglyphic form, to record their information. And obviously, you probably have heard of hieroglyphics. I mean, you might not have heard of Demotic. Maybe you haven't even heard of Coptic. Maybe you have. But hieroglyphics is the most famous of the ancient scripts of Egypt. One of the earliest forms of writing, not so much of a language, but of writing was like pictographs or hieroglyphics, which were symbols that represented sounds and ideas. Sometimes these were carved in stone, they were put into metalwork, but also it was written on papyrus, which is a paper-like material made from papyrus reeds. So throughout the several thousand years of ancient Egyptian civilization, at least 3 other scripts were used for the different purposes. And using these scripts, those that preserved the beliefs and historians, the history and ideas of ancient Egypt, the people that wrote these things were called scribes, using the different scripts of hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek. And they would write them on temple walls, on tomb walls, papyrus scrolls. They would write the different messages and histories and information in those hieroglyphic symbols. All right, students, we're doing pretty well here for the first PowerPoint. Pretty interesting stuff. It's amazing how some soldiers who were working on a fort unearthed the Rosetta Stone that we were able to then translate many hieroglyphs that for centuries the archaeologists didn't really even know what they said. But because of the Rosetta Stone in the early 19th century and all the discoveries that took place in the late 19th century, even early 20th century, we were able to translate many things that the Egyptians wrote in hieroglyphs. So it's just amazing. So we covered a lot today with all the different aspects of the beginning of the Egyptian civilization and Nile River and some of the early pharaohs. So we are going to wrap this video up now, and we will see you next time. Take care.